This is the Behind the Line podcast, coming to you from the wacky left coast capital of Seattle. News from the Pacific Northwest, the left coast, the U.S., and the world that matters. The stories the MSM won't talk about. Deciphering the truth through all the lies. For more, visit BehindTheLinePodcast.com.
Here's some breaking news for Washington State. The Washington State Senate on Saturday approved an assault weapons ban, a measure long sought by gun control advocates. HB 1240 passed the Senate in a 27-21 vote with one excused. The measure will go back to the House since it was amended by the Senate before it was sent to Governor Jay Inslee. The Washington State House in March passed the measure on a largely party line, 55-42. If the bill is signed into law, which it's going to be, Washington would join 9 other states that have enacted laws generally banning the sale, manufacture, and transfer of assault weapons, according to the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And I wonder how much that is done to actually prevent violence in those locations. Very little, I'm guessing. Attorney General Bob Ferguson praised the move, saying that the Senate put public safety above the interests of the gun lobby. Yeah, okay. Democratic Governor Jay Inslee watched the House vote in the chamber last month and called it very important. It is something that I've believed in since 1994 when I voted to make this federal law, said Inslee, who served in Congress before becoming governor. He said the legislature had broken the NRA's lock on Washington and that the vast majority of Washingtonians support this common sense measure. Okay, bud. With gun deaths hitting the highest mark seen in decades in the U.S., Democrats in Washington State have fixed their majorities to push the assault weapons ban while advancing other gun restrictions, including a 10-day waiting period for purchases and a bill that would hold gun makers liable for negligent sales. When are we going to start holding automobile manufacturers guilty for drunk driving accidents? Or beer manufacturers, or alcohol manufacturers? That's the same line of thinking. During the debate on the assault weapons bill, Democrats spoke of mass shootings frequently carried out by men wielding assault-style weapons such as AR-15s that have killed people in schools, churches, nightclubs, and grocery stores. State Rep. Daria Farivar, a Democrat from Seattle, lamented a modern cycle of deaths, sadness, thoughts, and prayers, and then back to business. She said she has experienced a shooter lockdown, and she decried the fearful reality faced by school children. Well, just put some armed guards at the schools and that'll put an end to that. But no, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to attack law-abiding citizens because this will do absolutely nothing to stop criminals from getting guns in their hands. Republicans argued the ban violates the federal and state constitutions and predicted it would be overturned. They also contend it would not stop criminals or prevent mass shootings while infringing on the rights of law-abiding people seeking to defend their families. Firearms are the great equalizer, said State Representative Travis Couture, Republican from Allen, touting their use to defend against all sorts of predators. The House bill lists more than 50 specific gun models that would be banned from future sales in the state, including military-style weapons such as AR-15s, AK-47s, and M16s, which you already can't buy in this state, you idiots. The M16, that is. It also lists characteristics of prohibited firearms, such as semi-automatic rifles with a length of less than 30 inches, and those that have detachable magazines or fixed magazines with a capacity of 10 rounds or more. Lawmakers have advanced the firearm restrictions as part of a package announced in December by Inslee and Attorney General Bob Ferguson. The State House also in March passed House Bill 1143, requiring a 10-day waiting period and safety training before all gun purchases. They had already been required for semi-automatic rifles. The state Senate last week approved a bill that would give the Washington Attorney General's office the authority to hold gun manufacturers or sellers liable for gun sales that result in the weapons landing in the hands of criminals or mass shooters. How exactly does that work? Each gun measures must still be considered and voted on in the coming weeks by the opposite chamber in the legislative session set to continue into late April. Folks, your rights are being violated hard. You are losing your right to protect yourself in the state of Washington. And as per usual, the criminals in this state have all the rights, have all the opportunities to take advantage of you and hurt you, take your property, etc., etc. This has to be stopped. This is the time for you to reach out to your representatives in the House and let them know this is not right. Also be a good time to reach out to gun rights organizations so that lawsuits can be lined up, because that's probably the route we're going to have to go, is to have this overturned, not in the state Supreme Court, because the state Supreme Court is going to back Inslee. We're going to have to seek justice outside of this state, because the current administration and the Democrats in this state do not want you to have the right to defend yourself. They don't even understand what these guns are. They like to pretend that it is the guns that commit the crime and not the crazy-ass people on the other end of the trigger. It only takes a few minutes to send an email to your representative. Please take the time to do that. See if we can somehow salvage this before it goes too far. Well, if you stood your ground against the COVID vaccines and have managed to keep yourself pure to this point, what way are they going to use to get it into your body now? Well, this is a report from Citizens News over mRNA vaccines being used on livestock, and whether or not after the animal is slaughtered and sent to market that mRNA is still in the meat that you will eat, and if that in turn will then get into your body. Here's the story. There is much debate over whether or not the administration of messenger RNA or mRNA vaccines in meat animals will in any way affect the quality of the meat. The establishment is suggesting that fully vaccinated meat is just as safe as natural meat, but what does the science say? On January 31st, 2022, MIT News published a piece revealing that RNA vaccines deliver therapies for gastrointestinal disease straight through the stomach and intestines. This would imply that the drugs distribute into the body, including in muscle tissue. The article is very straightforward, and readers are encouraged to read through it for themselves to see what MIT had to say versus what the government and media are now saying in defense of mRNA vaccine administration in meat animals. The general public is now awake about the threat of mRNA, and many who deliberately avoided taking the mRNA jabs during the pandemic worry that the food they are eating might vaccinate them without their knowledge and consent. One meat producer, Alder Spring Ranch and Organic Beef Matters, responded to inquiries it has been receiving lately about the use of the mRNA vaccines in meat cattle. Here's what Glenn Elzinga of Alder Spring Ranch had to say. When researching this subject, I found it very clear that no company is yet offering mRNA animal vaccines on the open market. First of all, no one drug company has laid claim to be the first to produce it or put methodologies in place that would allow for mass production. Second, I found many articles, some very recent, stating that the grant process is still ongoing. In other words, animal pharmaceutical production companies are just now getting money to explore the new technology for all classes of livestock. This is somewhat reassuring, but what about in the future when mRNA vaccines become commercially available for American livestock? Elzinga says it is still unknown if mRNA will transfer into the meat that people eat. The government says no, of course, but the government is known to lie. More than likely, the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Agriculture will require at least a 30-day delay period between the last use of the drug and the slaughter of the animal. the idea being that the mRNA will no longer be persistent after that time. Most mRNA research indicates that denaturing of the genetic material occurs within several days of vaccination, Elzinga argues. If it so happens that somehow mRNA material remains intact through ingestion, most scientists argue that mRNA is fairly fragile and would not survive the acidic environment of the stomach. To be clear, Elzinga is against the use of mRNA in animals. He says he has no interest in or plans to eat mRNA vaccinated animal products. Simply put, I will not eat them, he writes. Unfortunately for the average consumer, not every meat producer raises animals naturally and organically, like Alder Spring Ranch does, and since animal vaccines, as well as human vaccines, all seem to be moving in the direction of mRNA, chances are that in the future, all commercial meat will be contaminated with it to some degree, which is why it is important to source clean, pasture-raised meat and animal products from places like Alder Spring Ranch or a ranch near you, as opposed to buying it conventionally from the grocery store. Not to mention that there probably won't label the meat that has been vaccinated with mRNA anyway, so there'll be no way for us to even know that that's happened. Eat at your own risk. Here's a little story that I haven't seen get much play on the media, and it should be, because we're starting to see a little pattern here with these folks. Law enforcement officials in Colorado have arrested a transgender individual with a communist manifesto for allegedly planning mass shootings at schools and churches in the area. News of the arrest was made public on Thursday afternoon, but the arrest happened on March 31st, just a few days after a transgender terrorist massacred 6 people, including 3 children, at a private Christian school in Nashville. The individual, who the Daily Wire is not naming due to a company policy about not giving notoriety to mass killers or those who allegedly aspire to commit such atrocities, is a biological male who goes by a different female name and uses she/her pronouns. The 19-year-old was charged with criminal attempt to commit murder in the first degree, 2 counts, criminal mischief, menacing, and interference with staff, facility, or students of educational institutions. The suspect allegedly targeted Timberview Middle School, Prairie Hills Elementary, Pine Creek High School, and other targets were churches, according to KRDO, local news affiliate. A family member turned the suspect into police, telling 911 that they had threatened to shoot up schools and had severe anger issues. A spokesperson for the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office told local media that the suspect was in the process of transitioning. People said the home had trash piled up all around the house to where it made it hard to walk inside, and that there were numerous containers filled with half-eaten food and mold growing inside, and numerous alcoholic beverage containers laying around the house. The suspect allegedly punched holes in the wall inside the house and ripped a door off the hinges. The suspect allegedly visibly shook his head, indicating yes when asked by law enforcement if he was going to shoot up a school. The suspect said that he had been planning the attacks for over a month and had started planning and writing a manifesto. Evidence collected inside the house included the suspect's manifesto, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and a notebook with suicidal ideations. The suspect allegedly researched how to 3D print firearms, made detailed lists of numerous people to target, gathered information about how to make bombs, and made commentary about notorious mass shooters, serial killers, and politicians. Sounds like a great guy, he, she, whatever the hell he is, it is. This is what happens when you support people with mental illness. These trans mental people who we're supposed to accept, who society, mainstream media, liberal politicians are trying to normalize. This is a mental illness, and you see it playing out with these sort of actions. You see what's happening in women's sports with these people. Attacking a female swimmer recently. And all these people, all these men going into female sports who are being honored and recognized for their great achievements. I'm sorry, but this is largely a mental illness that we are supporting, that we are perpetuating. And you see how angry these individuals are if they feel like they're being slighted. Stories like this should be a motivation and a good advertisement for you to get your concealed weapons permit if your state allows it or requires it. Because you just never know where you're going to be when some nut job with a gun decides they're going to shoot everybody up because they're angry, because their feelings are hurt. Just to show you how far our federal government is willing to go to protect these transmentals, the Biden administration is proposing a bill or law that would bar schools from enacting outright bans on trans athletes. Schools and colleges across the U.S. would be forbidden from enacting outright bans on transgender athletes under a proposal released Thursday by the Biden administration. But teams could create some limits in certain cases, for example, to ensure fairness. The proposed rule sends a political counterpunch towards a wave of Republican-led states that have sought to ban trans athletes from competing in school sports that align with their gender identities. If finalized, the proposal would become enshrined as a provision of Title IX, the landmark gender equity legislation enacted in 1972. It must undergo a lengthy approval process, however, and it's almost certain to face challenges. While opponents sharply criticize the proposal, some advocates for transgender athletes were concerned it did not go far enough. The proposal comes on the same day that the Supreme Court said a 12-year-old transgender girl in West Virginia can continue competing on her middle school track and cross-country teams, while legal battles over the state's transgender law continue. The law bans transgender athletes from female teams. It's not fair to girls to let boys compete against them. And these transgender girls are boys. Girls work extremely hard in these sports that they play in to make it to the upper levels in college and professional, and they don't need men and boys coming into these sports and derailing all the hours and hours of effort they put in throughout their young lives to get there. If we're talking about fairness and equity, then we need to talk about fairness and equity. If there's all these transgenders that want to compete, then maybe they should have their own sports teams and leagues to play in. The federal government needs to stop ramming this crap down our throats. And while we're all running around the U.S. worried about our feelings and emotions and transgender people, in a report from a military expert recently in the Washington Times says the United States urgently needs to counter an ongoing undeclared political war being waged by China, according to a new book by retired Marine Colonel and China expert. America and Americans need to realize that they are, in fact, already at war with China. It may not be a quote-unquote war by American standards, but to the People's Republic of China, it certainly is, retired Colonel Grant Newsom said. Colonel Newsom, who was also a former Foreign Service officer in Asia, told the Washington Times in an interview that the U.S. elites need to understand that they are at risk of losing the conflict to Communist China. If the United States, or better said, Wall Street and our business class don't stop funding the Chinese economy, and by extension the People's Liberation Army, we really can't expect to prevail, he said. The United States must counter the threat posed by China using similar methods to those employed by Beijing, aggressively defending the U.S. democratic system and exploiting vulnerabilities in the ruling Chinese Communist Party through a coordinated political warfare campaign. If we do not respond intelligently before we realize it, we will become the United States with Chinese characteristics, Colonel Newsom writes in the book, When China Attacks. Colonel Newsom is a former intelligence officer who spent 40 years in the military and government. He argues that the ruling Chinese Communist Party does not distinguish between peacetime and wartime. Instead, China's leaders and government see themselves as engaged in a constant state of conflict with enemies, with the United States as the main adversary. The goal of Chinese President Xi Jinping is to replace the United States as the world's sole superpower, and a key to that goal is building up China's military strength. The People's Liberation Army has been rapidly expanding both conventional and nuclear forces in preparation for a future confrontation with the United States. The PLA, once a large ground force with obsolete weapons, has been retooled for modern warfare as China has grown wealthier and its technology sector has advanced. Colonel Newsom writes that the PLA is working towards creating military forces capable of defeating the U.S. military and protecting China's global assets, ports, factories, and farmland abroad. Currently, China's military could inflict major damage to U.S. forces close to China, but is less capable against the American military farther from China's shores. The PLA currently cannot project power globally, but could do so in the near future. Beijing's military budget is designed to meet two goals, relying on a force that includes advanced air and naval forces, long-range missiles, cyber and electronic warfare tools, and large and growing numbers of nuclear weapons. China's primary goal is defeating the United States and projecting power globally through Beijing prefers to achieve those objectives without a hot war, he said. Thus, China is engaged in political warfare against the United States, seeking to weaken and ultimately destroy the country, he said. Under Mr. Xi, China has reverted to a Marxist-Leninist worldview that regards the international situation as a constant struggle for domination against those that would try to prevent China from assuming its rightful place as the world's dominant superpower. This is both a Chinese view of things and a Marxist view of the constant and inevitable struggle between rival and implacably opposed systems, Colonel Newsom said. Only one can survive. That one is communism, according to Marx and Xi Jinping, as embodied by the Chinese Communist Party. Colonel Newsom states Chinese leaders will spend whatever it takes to achieve these two objectives. American leaders over the decades, he argued, have failed to comprehend that China has been waging low-level conflict, betting that U.S. leaders will not believe they are in a conflict unless and until shots are fired and war is declared. Everything else, even if Americans and others are imperiled, get hurt, or even killed, is just a misunderstanding or unprofessional behavior that at most results in a U.S. government official expressing concern, Colonel Newsom said, or, if it's really serious, grave concern. Instead, American military leaders describe the current political conflict with China as a gray zone war. Gray zone is the effect of kryptonite on us. We can't figure out what to do, and the Chinese know it, he writes. They behave aggressively because they think they can get away with it. Apparently, they have good reason to think so. With Americans increasingly concerned about the growing likelihood of a war with China, Colonel Newsom offers a series of recommendations to reduce the risk. The solution starts with the United States actively defending its system against Chinese political warfare and employing those same tactics against the CCP, Colonel Newsom writes. Psychological warfare is also needed to counter Beijing's low-level attacks that stop short of military action, he said. Americans, the author argues, must also awaken to the nature of communist and totalitarian regimes, following Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' 2022 policy of requiring schools to teach students about the historical record of atrocities by communist regimes. The U.S. government also should revive the Justice Department's China initiative that sought prosecutions against Chinese-linked cases of technology theft. The initiative was launched under the Trump administration but canceled by the Biden administration for what critics said was a practice of unfairly targeting Asians. Educating the public about China's human rights abuses and the ruling party's internal corruption is also needed, Colonel Newsom writes. Well, good old Biden is in bed with the Chinese, so that's not going to happen, and we're too worried about hurting people's feelings to do anything else drastic. I mean, we wouldn't want to unfairly target Asians, even if they're stealing secrets from the U.S., right? I mean, that could hurt somebody's feelings. How long before we wake up? All of these stories just show how the U.S. is swirling the bowl. The toilet's been flushed. Somebody needs to shut the water off before it all goes out of the bowl. A federal judge in Washington state on Friday ordered U.S. authorities not to make any changes that would restrict access to the abortion medication mifepristone in 17 Democratic-led states that sued over the issue, countering a ruling by a judge in Texas on the same day that ordered a hold on federal approval of this drug. The dueling decisions threw into question access into the nation's most common method of abortion, one that scientists have approved for use for decades. U.S. District Judge Matthew Kaczmarek, a Trump administration appointee in Amarillo, Texas, signed an injunction directing the Food and Drug Administration to stay the drug's approval while a lawsuit challenging the safety and approval of the drug continues. That ruling came in a lawsuit brought by the conservative group Alliance Defending Freedom. In Washington state, Spokane-based Judge Thomas O. Rice, an Obama administration appointee, partially granted a request from 17 states and the District of Columbia, while the states sued in an effort to expand access to the pill. Rice did not go that far. Instead, he blocked the FDA from making any changes to the drug's access in the states that sued. These are the things that the U.S. is so concerned about. Killing babies, our feelings and emotions, and letting trans mentals do whatever they want, whenever they want. All the while they're taking away your rights, stripping your firearm rights from you, stripping your freedom of thought and speech away from you. When will this insanity end? Meanwhile, the country is burning down. There are major problems all over the world, financially, politically, and with possible wars creeping up in various spots around the globe. And this is the stuff we are focusing our time on. It's just chaos, and I hope that you are preparing accordingly. I hope if you're not a prepper, that these things are making you see that you should be. Because at some point, the house of cards is going to come down. They can't keep this thing propped up like this much longer. I think we can all see that something major is coming. And where it comes from is anybody's guess. But something is coming. Prepare accordingly.
Thank you for listening to the Behind the Line podcast. If you like this broadcast, please like and share it. Please follow us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, Twitter, Truth Social, Telegram, Gab, Parler, and LinkedIn. You can find our podcast at BehindTheLinePodcast.com, NetNewsNetwork.net, and on Anchor, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and anywhere podcasts can be found. Thank you for your support.